calm criminal.
In the middle of the night, somewhere in the steaming black waters between Sumatra and Malaya, a wireless operator sent a message that no sailor who heard it would ever forget. The signal arrived in broken bursts of Morse code, hesitant and uneven, as if the man tapping the key was struggling to remain alive long enough to finish. The message was short. Every officer aboard his ship was dead. The captain lay in the chart room. Bodies were scattered across the bridge. The entire crew might already be gone. There was a pause after that, a long silence across the radio frequencies of the sea, before the operator returned to the key one final time and tapped out 2 final words. I die. The ship transmitting that message was a cargo steamer called the Ourang Medan, and what was discovered aboard her shortly afterward remains one of the most disturbing mysteries ever recorded at sea. The waters where the signal originated were among the busiest shipping lanes in the world, and several nearby vessels received fragments of the distress call that night. Merchant ships constantly monitored shared radio frequencies so they could assist one another in emergencies. And although distress signals were not uncommon in those dangerous post-war waters, nothing about this transmission sounded ordinary. The operator had not described a fire, a collision, or a mechanical failure. Instead, he had calmly reported that the crew around him were already dead. One of the vessels that received the message was the American freighter SS Silver Star, which immediately altered course toward the position of the signal. The captain understood that something deeply unusual had happened aboard the drifting ship, yet he still expected to find survivors, or at least some explanation waiting when his vessel arrived. The sea that morning was calm and strangely quiet, and the lookout eventually spotted the mysterious freighter sitting alone on the horizon. At first glance, the ship looked completely intact, riding the water as steadily as any healthy cargo vessel. As the Silver Star approached, however, something about the Ourang Medan began to feel unsettlingly wrong. The decks were empty, the bridge showed no movement, and no one appeared along the railings even after the American ship sounded its horn several times. Ships rarely drifted silently like that because even a vessel in trouble normally had sailors moving across the deck, waving for help or preparing lifeboats. The Ourang Medan showed no sign that anyone was alive aboard her. The captain of the Silver Star eventually ordered a small boarding party to investigate the vessel directly. Several experienced sailors climbed down into a launch and crossed the short distance between the two ships, expecting to discover a medical emergency or perhaps a mechanical accident that had incapacitated the crew. The morning air was heavy with tropical humidity, yet as the men climbed the rope ladder hanging from the freighter's side, they immediately noticed something strange. The deck of the ship felt unusually cold beneath their boots, and the air carried a faint chemical odour that none of them could identify. The first sailor to step onto the deck froze when he saw the body lying near the railing. The man had collapsed on his back with his eyes wide open and his mouth drawn into a rigid expression of horror. His arms were stretched outward as though he had attempted to push something away from him in the final seconds of his life. When the rest of the boarding party climbed aboard, They quickly realized that the dead man was only the first of many. Bodies were scattered across the deck in positions that suggested the men had died suddenly and without warning. One sailor lay near the cargo hatch with his hands raised toward the sky, while another had collapsed beside a coil of rope with his head tilted backward and his eyes staring upward. A third man had fallen halfway across the deck, with his fingers curled tightly, as if he had tried to grasp something in the air before collapsing. Every face carried the same expression of overwhelming fear, yet none of the men showed any visible wounds or injuries. The rescuers moved cautiously toward the bridge, stepping around the dead sailors as they tried to understand what had happened. Inside the chart room, they found the captain sitting at the navigation table with his head tilted backward and his eyes fixed on the ceiling above him. Several officers lay on the floor nearby, their bodies twisted into positions that suggested they had collapsed where they stood. One officer had both arms raised in front of his face, as though trying to shield himself from something approaching from above. The boarding party began to notice an unsettling pattern as they continued searching the vessel. Nearly every corpse appeared to be staring upward at something that was no longer there. Sailors on the deck had died looking toward the sky, officers on the bridge had died gazing at the ceiling, and the expressions frozen on their faces suggested they had witnessed something so terrifying that it had stopped their hearts instantly. As the rescuers moved further along the deck, they discovered the ship's dog lying near the stern. The animal's body was stiff, and its lips were pulled back in a savage snarl that exposed its teeth, as though it had died barking at something directly in front of it. Even in death, the dog appeared ready to attack whatever had approached the crew in those final moments. The silence aboard the Ourang Medan grew heavier the longer the rescuers remained on the ship. The engines were quiet, the rigging barely moved in the light wind, and the tropical heat outside seemed strangely absent within the ship's interior passages. Several of the men later said they felt an overwhelming sense that something was wrong with the ship itself, as though the vessel had been touched by something unnatural that had not yet fully left. The rescuers eventually realized that the mystery did not begin on the deck or even on the bridge. Whatever had killed the crew seemed to have swept through the entire ship at once, leaving the same expressions of terror on the faces of men who had died in completely different parts of the vessel. The only place they had not yet searched was the lower deck, where the engine room and cargo holds lay beneath the silent corridors. As the boarding party prepared to descend into the depths of the ship, several of the sailors hesitated at the top of the ladder because the air drifting upward from below felt colder than the morning breeze outside. One of the men later said that moment was when he first felt certain that whatever had killed the crew of the Ourang Medan was not something ordinary. The dead men scattered across the deck looked less like victims of an accident and more like witnesses to something they had never expected to see at sea. The boarding party eventually began climbing down into the darkness below the deck, unaware that the most disturbing discoveries aboard the Ourang Medan were still waiting beneath them. The ladder leading down from the main deck descended into a narrow steel passageway that carried the faint smell of oil, rust, and something far more difficult to identify. The men moved slowly, their boots echoing against the metal steps as they descended into the lower levels of the ship. Even before they reached the engine room, several of the rescuers noticed that the air below deck felt far colder than the tropical heat outside. The Strait of Malacca was known for its suffocating humidity, yet the interior of the Ourang Medan carried a chill that felt unnatural, as though the warmth of the outside world had somehow been pushed away from the vessel entirely. When the boarding party stepped into the engine room, the sight waiting for them confirmed that whatever had killed the crew had swept through every corner of the ship. The engineers lay exactly where they had been working moments before death overtook them, frozen in positions that suggested shock rather than injury. One man had collapsed against the control console with his head tilted backward and his eyes wide open. Another lay across the metal grating with one arm stretched upward toward the overhead pipes as if he had tried to grab something above him. The chief engineer was found near the ladder leading back toward the deck. His body had fallen sideways, with one hand raised defensively in front of his face, and the rigid tension in his fingers made it look as though he had died while attempting to ward off something approaching him. The rescuers carefully examined each body and found the same disturbing detail repeated again and again. None of the men showed any sign of injury, yet every face carried the same expression of pure terror. The machinery surrounding them appeared perfectly intact. The engines were silent but undamaged. The pipes showed no signs of rupture, and there were no scorch marks or broken fittings anywhere in the compartment. It looked as though the engine room had simply stopped in the middle of its normal operation, while the men working there collapsed where they stood. One of the rescuers leaned closer to examine the chief engineer and noticed that the man's skin carried a faint bluish tint, which might have suggested suffocation, yet the position of the body told a very different story. The engineer's eyes were fixed upward. The rescuers began to notice the same pattern that had disturbed them on the upper deck. Nearly every man in the engine room had died while looking toward the ceiling, as though something had appeared above them in the seconds before their deaths. One sailor muttered quietly that it felt as though the entire crew had seen the same thing at the same moment, even though they had been scattered throughout the ship. The men searched the rest of the engine compartment and discovered nothing that could explain the disaster. The controls were in normal positions. The gauges showed no obvious signs of malfunction, and there were no traces of explosion or flooding. The faint chemical odour that had been noticeable on the deck seemed slightly stronger here, but it still was not powerful enough to explain how an entire crew could have died so quickly. Beyond the engine room lay a narrow corridor leading toward the cargo holds. The boarding party followed it cautiously, their flashlights casting long shadows across the metal walls. As they moved deeper into the ship, several of the rescuers began to feel an uneasy sensation that they later struggled to describe. The silence below deck was so complete that even their breathing seemed too loud, and the cold air surrounding them created the strange impression that they had stepped into a place that had been abandoned for far longer than a few hours. The hatch leading into the forward cargo hold was still secured, though the latch was not locked. One of the men carefully lifted the heavy cover, while the others shone their lights into the darkness below. The beam of the first flashlight revealed rows of wooden crates stacked neatly along the walls, each one secured with rope and braces to prevent shifting during rough seas. At first glance the cargo appeared undisturbed, yet the faint chemical smell drifting from the hold was stronger here than anywhere else on the ship. Two of the rescuers climbed down into the hold to examine the crates more closely. Several of the boxes carried faded markings that appeared to be chemical labels, written in European languages, though the letters were difficult to read in the dim light. One crate had been slightly damaged, and when the men pried open its lid, they discovered sealed containers packed tightly together inside. No one aboard the boarding party was a chemist, but the containers appeared to hold some form of industrial compound. Later speculation suggested the cargo might have included substances such as potassium, cyanide, or other volatile chemicals that were commonly transported in the chaotic shipping markets of Southeast Asia after the war. The problem with that explanation, however, was that the containers showed no obvious signs of leakage, and there was no visible residue that would suggest a massive chemical release. The rescuers climbed back up to the corridor and continued exploring the lower decks. As they moved through the narrow passageways, they discovered several more members of the crew lying in small compartments along the ship's interior. One sailor had collapsed in the doorway of a storage room, with both hands raised toward the ceiling, and another was found near a ladder leading upward, with his back pressed against the wall and his eyes staring at the overhead pipes. Everybody told the same story. The men had died suddenly, they had died without injury, and they had died looking upward as though something had appeared above them that none of the rescuers could see. The boarding party eventually returned to the upper deck and gathered near the rail to discuss what they had found. The sun had climbed higher in the sky by then, and the tropical heat had returned to the open air above the ship, yet several of the men still felt a lingering chill that refused to leave them. One sailor quietly remarked that the ship did not feel empty, despite the fact that every man aboard it was dead. Another rescuer admitted that he had the uneasy impression that something had moved through the vessel shortly before they arrived, leaving the bodies behind like discarded shells. The captain of the Silver Star had been waiting anxiously for their report, and the men shouted their findings across the water to the crew of the American freighter. It quickly became clear that there were no survivors anywhere aboard the Ourang Medan, and the decision was made to tow the vessel back to port so that authorities could investigate the strange deaths. A thick towing cable was prepared and carried across to the silent ship. The sailors worked quickly because none of them wanted to remain aboard the eerie freighter any longer than necessary. As the line was secured and the final preparations were made, one of the men noticed something unusual drifting upward from one of the cargo vents near the center of the ship. At first it looked like nothing more than a faint wisp of smoke, rising slowly into the warm morning air. Within moments the thin wisp thickened into a darker plume that curled lazily above the deck. Then someone shouted that the cargo hold was beginning to burn. The first thing the men noticed was the smell changing. The faint chemical scent that had lingered across the ship suddenly sharpened into something acrid and biting, the kind of odour that makes the throat tighten and the eyes sting. At the same moment, a thin ribbon of grey smoke began slipping out of one of the cargo vents near the centre of the deck. At first it rose lazily into the humid morning air, but within seconds the smoke thickened and darkened until there was no mistaking what the men were seeing. Something inside the Ourang Medan had begun to burn. The boarding party reacted instantly, because sailors are trained to treat smoke aboard a cargo vessel as the beginning of a disaster. Fires at sea are among the most dangerous situations a crew can face, especially when the cargo includes unknown chemicals or volatile materials. Two of the rescuers ran towards the hatch leading down into the cargo hold, while the others shouted across the water to warn the crew of the Silver Star that something had gone wrong. The sailors, who had already spent time below deck, knew exactly where the smoke was coming from, and none of them liked the thought of opening that hatch again. When the hatch was pulled back, the smoke surged upward far more violently than before. A wave of hot air burst from the darkness below and carried with it the same chemical stench that had filled the engine room earlier. Several of the rescuers coughed immediately and staggered back from the opening because the fumes burned their throats and lungs the moment they inhaled them. The smoke pouring out of the cargo hold had a strange yellow-grey colour that suggested some kind of chemical reaction rather than an ordinary fire. Then the men heard something from inside the hold that made every one of them freeze for a moment. A series of sharp cracking sounds echoed up through the darkness below, like glass containers bursting one after another under intense heat. The noise was followed by a low rumbling vibration that seemed to travel through the metal structure of the ship itself. Every sailor present understood what those sounds meant, because cargo ships sometimes carried materials that became extremely dangerous when exposed to heat. Someone shouted that they needed to abandon the ship immediately. The rescuers rushed back toward the rope ladder hanging over the side of the freighter, while the smoke behind them grew thicker by the second. As they ran across the deck, they passed the same silent corpses they had discovered earlier, and more than one sailor later admitted that the dead men looked even more disturbing in the growing haze. The bodies seemed almost to emerge from the smoke, with their wide staring eyes fixed upward exactly as they had been when the boarding party first discovered them. The strange detail that several of the rescuers later remembered most clearly was the direction those eyes were facing. Even as the smoke rolled across the deck and the sailors hurried toward the ladder, the dead crew of the Ourang Medan appeared to be staring not at the flames rising from the cargo hold, but at the sky above the ship. The same expression of frozen terror remained locked on their faces, as though whatever they had seen before their deaths had appeared somewhere above them rather than within the ship itself. The boarding party climbed down the ladder as quickly as they could and dropped into the small launch waiting below. The men in the boat immediately began rowing hard toward the Silver Star, while the crew aboard the American freighter shouted warnings and prepared to pull them aboard. By the time the rescuers reached the side of the larger ship, thick smoke was pouring steadily out of the cargo vents of the Ourang Medan and spreading across the surface of the water like a dark cloud. The captain of the Silver Star ordered the engines reversed so that the freighter would begin moving away from the burning vessel. Everyone on deck understood that if the cargo inside the mysterious ship contained volatile chemicals, the entire vessel could explode without warning. The launch carrying the boarding party was hauled back aboard as quickly as possible, and the men barely had time to climb onto the deck before the first explosion occurred. The blast came from somewhere deep inside the hull of the Ourang Medan and sounded like a massive metal drum being struck by a hammer the size of a building. The ship shuddered violently as a burst of darker smoke shot upward from the cargo hold, and the sudden concussion echoed across the calm sea with a deep booming sound. Pieces of metal clattered across the deck while flames began licking upward through the open hatch. The Silver Star continued backing away while the crew watched the doomed freighter from a growing distance. Within moments, a second explosion erupted from the center of the ship, far louder than the first. This one sent a violent column of flame roaring into the air and blew several sections of the deck plating outward in a shower of twisted steel. The fire spread with terrifying speed, racing along the structure of the vessel as though something deep inside the cargo hold had ignited all at once. What happened next lasted only seconds, yet every man aboard the Silver Star would remember it for the rest of his life. A massive explosion tore through the middle of the Ourang Medan with a deafening roar that shook the air across the water. Witnesses later said the blast lifted the central portion of the freighter upward in a violent eruption of flame and smoke, before the hull split apart under the force of the detonation. The ship began sinking almost immediately. Water rushed through the shattered structure while the bow dipped sharply beneath the surface. Flames continued burning across the broken decks as the stern lifted high into the air, exposing the dark underside of the hull for a brief moment before the entire vessel slid beneath the waves. Within minutes, the sea closed over the wreckage, and only scattered debris and drifting smoke remained to mark the place where the ship had been. The Ourang Medan had vanished. The crew of the Silver Star watched the empty water in stunned silence because they understood that whatever had killed the men aboard that ship had disappeared with it into the depths of the sea. There would be no investigation of the bodies, no detailed examination of the cargo, and no chance to determine exactly what had happened during the final moments of the doomed vessel. All that remained were the memories of the boarding party and the disturbing details they had witnessed aboard the silent freighter. Every one of those sailors would later repeat the same observation when asked about the scene they had found. The crew of the Ourang Medan had not looked like men who died from poison, fire, or mechanical failure. They had looked like men who had seen something impossible, and whatever that thing had been, it had appeared somewhere above them during the final seconds of their lives. After the Ourang Medan vanished beneath the water, the men aboard the Silver Star were left with nothing except the memory of what they had seen, and the unbearable feeling that they had stepped into the aftermath of something far worse than an ordinary maritime disaster. In the years that followed, officials, journalists, radio men, and sailors all tried to force the story into a shape that made practical sense. They suggested poison gas, unstable chemicals, military contraband, and smuggling accidents, all of which sounded reasonable enough on paper, but none of those explanations ever truly matched the details that mattered most, and the details were the only things the boarding party had been certain of. The dead crew had not looked like men overcome gradually by fumes. They had looked like men who had witnessed something so horrifying and so unnatural that death struck them in the middle of their reaction to it. Their arms were raised, their mouths were open, their eyes were fixed upward, and their faces were rigid with the kind of terror that belongs to the final instant before a nightmare becomes real. Even the ship's dog had died in open aggression, snarling at something invisible in front of it. And that detail matters more than it first appears, because animals do not rationalize fear the way people do. They react to presence, threat, and instinct, and whatever had moved through that ship had been felt by the animal just as clearly as it had been seen by the men. The most practical theory has always been that the ship was carrying volatile chemicals and that toxic fumes killed the crew before an explosion destroyed the evidence. There are versions of the story that mention cyanide, nitroglycerin, sulfuric acid, and other dangerous substances that could plausibly have been transported quietly through the chaotic ports of Southeast Asia after the war. Yet even if the cargo had been dangerous, that still does not explain why men in different parts of the vessel died in defensive postures while looking upward at the same unseen point. Gas can choke a man, weaken him, or render him unconscious, but it does not make an entire ship's company recoil in synchronized terror, as though they were all watching the same impossible thing descend upon them. That is where the story darkens, because once the ordinary explanations begin failing, the mind is forced to turn toward something far older and stranger. Sailors have always believed that the sea holds things beyond easy understanding, and a man who spends enough time on the water eventually learns how many stories repeat the same pattern in different oceans and in different centuries. Ships report lights where no lights should be, voices where no voices should be, figures on deck where no one is standing, and moments of unnatural cold that drift through warm air like the breath of another world. The Ourang Medan carries all the marks of that darker class of story, the kind sailors repeat only after enough drink has loosened the memory but not softened it. The chill aboard the ship is one of the details that continues to trouble me most because it feels so specific and so wrong. The men who boarded her stepped out of tropical heat into an atmosphere that felt unnaturally cold, and the cold deepened below deck as though the heart of the ship had become a kind of hollow chamber cut off from the laws of the natural world. That sort of sudden cold appears again and again in accounts of hauntings, apparitions, and malignant presences, not as theatrical decoration, but as a physical symptom of something other. If that ship had merely been contaminated by chemicals, the men might have smelled it or coughed from it. But a true cold that settles into metal corridors in tropical weather suggests something more invasive, more intimate, and far less earthly. Then there is the matter of the upward gaze. I cannot get away from it, and neither could the sailors who told the story afterward. Men on deck died looking at the sky, officers in the chart room died looking at the ceiling, engineers in the machinery spaces died looking at the overhead bulkheads, and all of them wore the same expression of total, paralyzing dread. It is as though something passed above every compartment at once, or perhaps through them, as if the structure of the ship itself meant nothing to it. One begins to imagine a presence moving over the vessel like a shadow with intelligence, pausing over each man long enough for him to understand that he was seeing something he was never meant to see. That final radio operator may be the most haunting figure in the entire story, because he seems to have survived longer than the others, long enough to comprehend the scene around him, and long enough to tell the world what had happened aboard the ship. I often think of him sitting alone in the radio room, hearing nothing but the dead silence of the vessel, and perhaps the faint creak of steel around him, knowing that every officer was already gone, and that whatever had taken them was still somewhere nearby. He did not send a normal distress call, because a normal distress call belongs to a world in which danger can be named, measured, and survived. Instead, he described the dead, paused, and then sent those final 2 words as though something had reached him in the middle of transmission. The disappearance of the ship's records only deepens the paranormal feeling of the case, because it gives the whole event the texture of something that erupted briefly into the visible world and then withdrew. The vessel is difficult to pin down in registries, ownership records are uncertain, and even its nationality has remained slippery. That absence of paperwork could be blamed on wartime chaos, smuggling, or bureaucratic failure, but it also contributes to the uncanny sense that the Ourang Medan was never meant to be fully known. It appears in the historical record only at the exact moment it becomes a chamber of death, and then it explodes and sinks before anyone can subject it to ordinary scrutiny. If one accepts, as I do, that the story is true in its essential form, then the most disturbing conclusion is also the simplest. The crew of the Ourang Medan did not die from cargo alone, though the cargo may have played some part in the final destruction of the ship. They died because something came aboard that vessel, or rose within it, or passed over it in a form so dreadful that hardened sailors, engineers, officers, and even the ship's dog were reduced in the same instant to terror. Whatever it was, it moved through the ship with absolute authority, leaving no wound that human medicine could point to, because the injury was deeper than flesh. It was an encounter, not an accident, and the explosion that followed feels less like a random, mechanical consequence than a final erasure, as though the ship itself had to be destroyed because no trace of that presence was meant to remain floating on the sea. That, to me, is why the story endures. It is not merely a ghost ship tale, though people often reduce it to that because the phrase is neat and familiar. It is really a story about contact with something malign and incomprehensible in one of the loneliest places a person can be, the open sea at night, where there is nowhere to run and no one to help you except the men already dying around you. The Ourang Medan drifts through memory because it suggests that the world still contains thresholds, and that sometimes a ship can cross one without meaning to. Long after the wreck went down, sailors continued to repeat the final message, because it sounds less like a distress call than like a fragment of testimony torn from a man at the edge of the unknown. All officers, including captain, dead, lying in chart room and bridge. Possibly whole crew dead. Those are not the words of a man describing a simple emergency. They are the words of someone reporting the aftermath of a visitation. Then came the last phrase, brief enough to fit in the space between two heartbeats, and terrible enough to outlive the ship itself. I die.